Hello and welcome to our first episode of Screenwriting Studies, the podcast. You may call it the second season. It's been some time since episode 6, but now for episode 7, we have Tom Stempel, one of the godfathers, so to say, of screenwriting studies. Tom is a long time colleague and friend of us. His book Framework about the history of screenwriting is one of the first ones in of its kind. There are others that followed his lead, including my own, but it really was the first and the for a long time the only book where could find something about the history of screenwriting and also the early history. Uh, Tom is the receiver of the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Screenwriting Research Network, and so far the only one. And his chapter in our handbook is chapter 12. They actually had scripts in silent films, researching screenwriting in the silent era. So, what I want to do for starting is what you describe in your chapter and what we also talked about sometimes, and what we also talked with Stephen Price in the episode. He was our guest. Is back in the day when you go to the archives and you're looking for screenplays, how do you find them? Especially when there is this myth, and especially in silent cinema, that there were no screenplays. Oh, they did it all on improvisation, and Griffiths, for example, didn't use scripts, or slapstick productions didn't use script. And then you have to be somehow persistent, and you did find something. And then it started, or how did it go? Who did you who did help you, and what did it need to get started into this?
Well, one of the first things I did when I started on Framework, dealing with the silent era first, was I went back and read Kevin Brownlow's The Parades Gone By, because I remembered he had a section there. But when I reread it, it's the skimpiest section you can imagine. And I knew Kevin, and I met him in London a year or two later, and told him that it wasn't, really very impressive. And instead of hitting me over the head, he agreed. And so he was very encouraging, and he suggested places. The two places that were enormously helpful, one was the Margaret Herrick Library, the Academy. And I always recommend telling people in the library what you're doing, and they tell other people. And one guy came in, and one of the librarians said, we have in the basement or the storage room or something, several boxes of screenplays from the Max Sennett studios. And I just nearly fell off the floor, because Sennett was notorious for claiming that, we didn't have scripts, we wrote things on the back of envelopes, we make it up as we go along, and everything like that. And so he asked me if I wanted to see them, and of course I said yes. I'm no fool, And they were absolutely fascinating, because they confirmed that there was a lot of screenwriting going on at the Sennett Studios. There were rehearsals. Who knew they had rehearsals? They had rehearsals. They had notes from the rehearsals. There were different drafts of the script, treatments, notes. Sennett says in his autobiography that they hired a court reporter to write down all the gags. Well, the transcripts of the court reporters' tapes are there, and you can see they wrote down everything. the complete record of the conference. So you're looking at the scripts. I also knew, and I'm not sure I knew this, that the Library of Congress had scripts from Thomas Ince. And they also had films by Ince. And Eddie Aslan, who had done a doctoral thesis on history of screenwriting, the early history of screenwriting, had looked at the scripts. And when I met him, we had a long discussion about what do all those notes mean on the scripts. But he had not looked at the films. And I thought, aha, this is a really good chance to go see the scripts and see the films and see what the differences are. And there were a lot of differences. The legend with Ince was the scripts were setting it in stone, and you did what was written. It was a legend that Thomas Ince had a rubber stamp that said shoot as written. And I was checking with friends and people all over the world, and nobody has ever found real evidence that this stamp existed. But anyways, I went down to the Library of Congress and we set it up so that in one room I could read the scripts and in the next room I could look at the films. And that was enormously revealing. And then I discovered there were other libraries that occasionally had some silent scripts as well. The Library of Congress was the big one. Museum of Modern Art in New York, which I visited. And UCLA has some, I think, but not very many. So you go looking and you tell people what you're interested in, and this is particularly true at the Academy. This is a funny story unrelated to screenwriting, but I'll tell it anyway. In 1956, when the Ten Commandments, the DeMille Ten Commandments came out, there was a news story that I read in the paper. I was like 14 years old, that some guy had seen the Ten Commandments and went out and killed his mother or his mother-in-law, saying that the movie had made him do that. That stuck in my mind. Years later, I'm at a movie and I come out, and because there had been riots about this particular film before, there was a guy, TV camera, asking people, and movie was Set It Off. It was all black cast. And I'm the only white guy in the audience that comes out. So I can see his eyes light up, a white middle-aged guy talking about the movie. And I love the movie. But we were talking about audiences and the fact that it's the audience that brings their attitudes to it. And I told the story of the Ten Commandments. And that's the one thing he used in the coverage that night. But I figured, I was writing a book about audiences at the time, and I figured the next time I go to the Academy Library, I am going to see if I can find some evidence that that story existed or is true. And I went to the library, looked at the clipping files, nothing, all of that. I went to the far end, the research desk, and said, I'm looking for this. And she suggested something. It wasn't in there. So I sat down around the tables to start reading the stuff I'm reading. A half an hour later, somebody comes along and says, are you the guy looking for the thing about the Ten Commandments? Yeah. He says, well, I thought it was here. And I went and looked, and it's not there. Oh, well, thank you very much. Go back to reading. Half an hour later, another person comes up. You're the guy looking for stuff about Ten Commandments. About 3 or 4 people, because once the word got around, were looking for this story and nobody's found it. Everybody is, that's librarians. They'll do anything to find what you're looking for. And that's particularly true at the Herrick Library. I don't know if they have a training session to teach you to do that, but for the 50-some years I've been going to the library in its various locations, they've always been incredibly helpful. So be nice to the librarians. Librarians are wonderful people.
Yeah, it's impossible to find what you're looking at without librarians. So at UCLA, without the librarian there, I would never have found the minutes of the of the story conferences, because it's in between the screenplays, but there are different places within the archive where you have this version of the screenplay and then the other version, and it for this version then they edit the minutes, and in the other version it's not there, and there is still no online database where you can find all this additional material, like minutes of story conferences, and you never know what you will find. People are also telling you that these things that you are looking at does not exist.
And
So
they turn out
and it is, I mean, so the screenplays for Senate it does not exist because it's all improvised. It's all this making up the myth of we're so fresh and we don't need a screenplay, and that is really difficult to get over with and really find the material that then is able to revise the history, which you has started with within frameworks, and then and others have found screenplays of this area, especially in the 1910s and so. And about the silent screenplays, what did you find most interesting about the differences in format and in finding a way to write down a film? Because looking at these very early screenplays, they differ very much from what we now know as a master scene script and so on.
Yeah, I found a little bit of that. I wasn't that interested in screenplay format. And I know that Stephen Price has pinged on me because he did a whole wonderful book on the history of the screenplay. And I know in his piece in the book here, he pings on me a little bit for not doing more, but I wanted to leave something for everybody else to do. You know, I say that in the introduction to framework. You know, this is just the start, and I want to encourage people to do that. One of the other things that I found that I was looking for stuff on what was I looking for stuff for? Screenplays on the Tim Holt westerns of the 1940s, the B picture westerns. And I had a friend of mine who had worked at the RKO file. So I called him up and I said, are you still with them? And he says, no. Well, do you know where the RKO files went? And he was sort of shocked that he didn't know, and he didn't know. And I said, well, do you know anybody who might? So he says, well, try Ned Comstock. Ned Comstock, with his USC, he knows everything. Everybody says Ned knows everything. And I called up Ned and say, hi, Joe said I should call you. And do you know where the RKO scripts are? And he was gobsmacked that he didn't know either. I said, well, who else do you suggest that I should talk to? And he gave me the name of the research librarian at UCLA. And I thought, this is probably not going to work, but I called her up and said, do you know where the RKO scripts are? Yeah, we got them here. Okay, so now I can find all that stuff there. So what I found is very, very useful. If you're talking to people and they don't know something, see if they can suggest somebody who does. I know we all talk about framework, and thank you very much, I love it. But for the book on TV writing that I did, a couple of the best interviews I got were because I'd said, who else do you think I should talk to? And they would suggest somebody, and they would be wonderful. So it's not simply looking at the files, it's talking to the people you think will know about this. You know, make friends with librarians. Librarians are wonderful people.
But going back to the way these early screenplays are written, if we go beyond just format, at the very early stage, you don't even realize that these are screenplays because they don't look like that. And so the very earliest from 1905, they look like theater plays, or the circumstance that in almost any silent screenplay, you have dialogue, more or less. You have lines for the actors, and if you when you first uh, read these early screenplays, what came to your mind, or what questions popped up, and
That it
what was
was
your impression? Or
the this is the very beginning. They don't know what they're doing. Nobody knows what they're doing. They're writing this stuff down because they find that it saves them time if they've got something there on paper or the backs of the envelopes, as the legend goes, that this is what we're going to have to get in the scene. And there's an early example in the framework of that it's almost more like a treatment than a screenplay
Mhm.
because people did not have an idea of what a screenplay should be because they didn't have an idea what a movie should be even. Um, and then as they go along, it develops in different ways. Yeah, on the dialogue in the silent screenplays, partly that evolves out of the fact that actors were ad-libbing and sometimes they were saying things that lip readers could read and say, oh God, they shouldn't say that. And so they wanted to get it more closely. And then, of course, later in the silent films, the directors that take advantage of that. It's in What Price Glory, I think, where the actors are swearing, and you can tell that they are swearing. By if you can, you'd even have to be a great lip reader, but I like it's fairly clear what that is. And then, of course, after the production code comes in, you can't really do that. But we all love the pre-code films. Yeah, and I suspect one of the reasons that screenplays get to look more and more like stage plays is you have people coming over from the theater, actors, writers, although most of the writers from the theater who come to the movies briefly in the late teens and then again after the introduction of sound really had no idea how to write screenplays or how to write for movies even. And that created this uh, mythology on the East Coast that if you go to Hollywood, you're selling your soul to the devil. You'll never come back to civilized society, which of course was nonsense. In the 30s, for example, Ben Hecht and Charlie MacArthur were bouncing back and forth from New York writing plays to writing movies. Same thing with Goodrich and Hackett, who wrote the Thin Man movies, some of the Thin Man movies. Happened all the time, and it happens even more now. And people don't even think about it very much. That mythology that you lose your soul and you lose your talents when you go to Hollywood is just nonsense. There are a lot of people who think that about Fitzgerald. Uh, his books weren't selling. He went to Hollywood. He wasn't very successful as a screenwriter. Only has one credit. You say, yeah, the man has lost his talent. Yeah, you go read the chapters that survive of The Last Tycoon, and then try and tell me this is a guy who's lost his talent. He has not lost his talent at that point. And that's true of a lot of others as well.
Do we have questions already, or shall we continue?
Can you hear
Rosamund
me?
or Stephen? Yes.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to, hi Tom, great to see you.
Hi, Stephen.
I just wanted to, it's just actually following on from the conversation you were just having. I wonder if when Klaus was talking about these very early scripts that resemble stage plays, all the ones that I know of, I think, were written on the East Coast. And the ones that you're discussing in Framework, I mean, it's very interesting the way that you tie them into actually being taken on location by kind of pioneer directors out and making these sort of early westerns and things like this. I wonder if just the actual conditions of production meant that the format could be completely different. If I'm making kind of location film on the, in the Wild West, as opposed to doing something for a studio in the East.
Could be, but they do go on location in the East, not as far as they go on locations in the West. I mean, that's one of the reasons the movies ended up in LA is you've got a big city, you've got the beach, you've got the mountains, you've got the desert, all within a day or so drive. Okay, maybe 2 days before the interstates, but anyway, that you can get to. That may be, I think you got a point there, that if they're going out and they're going to be away from the studio, if you're going to be out in the desert, then it helps if you have something written that you can look at and say, yeah, oh yeah, we wanted to shoot this. And as the pictures get longer, I mean, for a 10-minute film, maybe you can get away without having an outline or a script, but as they get longer, you need to have the script or you'll end up wasting a lot of time and money.
I think it might have been one of the Dawley scripts. I'm trying to remember which one. But you said you've got this sheet of paper that's been folded over, and you say it was folded over so the director and camera person could put it in their pocket. I was just wondering, do you know that that's true, or were you just inferring?
I don't know that that's true, but it's folded the way a letter is folded, and in some cases it's got a sort of cardboard backing, and it would fit in the pocket. And if you're going out and around on the locations, you got to carry it somewhere. It seems logical to me. If Stephen, if you find something that says no, they didn't do it that way, let me know because I'm still interested in stuff.
Will do.
All right.
I was just wondering if you could say a bit about what got you into this in the beginning. Like everyone was saying there weren't any scripts. No one was very interested in the script side of things, but just in the films. And what was it that sort of inspired you? Like, what drove you to kind of start and pursue your search for?
Yeah, I was a graduate student at UCLA studying screenwriting. I got an MFA screenwriting. Never sold any of my scripts. I wrote stage plays, never sold any of them. Wrote a novel based on one of the screenplays, didn't sell that. So I obviously had to find something else to do. And one of the things that happened, I took a graduate seminar in American film history. It was set up by Howard Suber, who was setting up the Oral History of the Motion Pictures Project. And he had each of us in the class write a research paper on somebody who was still alive, who had a distinguished career in the movie business. And then the idea was that he would pick the people who did the best papers and have them go out and interview their subjects. I wrote a paper on Darryl Zanuck. I was at the wrong end of the table. Howard was sitting here, I was sitting over here. This is the first meeting, and he went around the room and he had a list of potential subjects. And everybody else got the good ones until it got to me. And Zanuck was the only one left who was interested. Well, Howard didn't want to do that, didn't want to do producers the first year. And he said, he originally didn't have me doing anything, but he called up later and other people had dropped out. And so I said, do you want me to do Zanuck? He says, no, not this time. He says, well, who do you want to do? And I thought, well, I'm studying screenwriting. Why don't I do a screenwriter who worked with Zanuck, because I got the Zanuck material? And he said, sure, who? I looked at the list. Well, Dudley Johnson has the most interesting ones, I think. Howard said, is he still alive? I said, how the hell should I know? And it turned out Dudley had just moved back to LA. He'd been out of town, out of the country for 10 years or so. And we met and we got along great. And the UCLA Oral History Project said, tried to do 11 hours, which has always baffled me. Why not 10 hours? Why not an even dozen hours? I suspect they had a big argument somewhere in the meeting somewhere. Anyway, they said, try to do 11 hours. Nunnally and I did 23 and a half hours. And I thought, that's big enough for a book. Truffaut has done the book with Hitchcock. We could sell this as a question and answer book. Nobody wanted it because Nunnally had not made Psycho and I had not directed The 400 Blows. So there was no interest there. But a lot of publishers said, we would like to buy your research, which wasn't mine to sell, I'm under consideration. You would like to buy your research, and so somebody can write a biography of Johnson for that. I said, no, I want to do it as a Q&A book. And finally, got a call one day from the agent I had who said he talked to a publisher in New York, and it was the same thing. We don't want to do the Q&A. We want to buy the research and hire a writer to do the biography. And Stuart, my agent, thinking like an agent, bless his heart, said, well, why don't you hire Tom to do it? He knows Nunnally Johnson. He's done the research. And the publisher said, oh no, we want to hire a professional writer. And he told me that, and I just fell out of my chair. And I said, they don't have Olympics for writers. This was back when Olympic Games were amateurs. I'm perfectly willing to turn pro. And we got a laugh out of that. And I began to think that I don't really want to turn over this material to anybody else. And my agent wanted me to do it. And I went on, I talked to Nunnally. Nunnally said, I asked him, I explained the situation. I said, how would you feel about me doing it? And he would have been perfectly justified to say no, he didn't. He said, I would be honored if you would. Well, if Nunnally Johnson tells you he would be honored for you to write his biography, you damn well better write his biography. It was also my PhD dissertation. And one of the committee members said, since this is a new field and nobody knows about it, you should do something to set Johnson's career in context. So what I did was I wrote an introduction. It was sort of a mini history of screenwriting. And as I'm writing that, I think, there could maybe be a whole book on the history of screenwriting. So I finished the Nunnally Johnson book, sweating blood because my prose writing was terrible. That's the book I learned how to write readable prose on. And so then I started thinking about, okay, that. And my original idea was, I have no idea if there's going to be enough material for a book on the history of screenwriting. So the first sort of semi-structural idea was the 3 sections that you see now, and then a 4th section on television writing, if I couldn't find enough on screenwriting. Well, we know now there's more than enough for a book on screenwriting, and television became the next one. So that was the start. And I started from the things that I said in the introduction. I mentioned Frank Woods, and I said, is Frank Woods to D.W. Griffith what Herman Mankiewicz was to Orson Welles? And one of the first things I did was try to find material on Woods, and then simply going to the libraries and reading books. I discovered a lot had been written about screenwriting that hadn't made it into the history books. I was astonished when Kevin Brownlow told me that he had not read William DeMille's Hollywood Saga, which was DeMille's autobiography, where he starts as a writer. His brother Cecil comes out to Hollywood, and you can work, and he works as a writer, and then he becomes a director. So he's seen the director-writer conflict from both sides of it. Absolutely first-rate material. So I just get into that, and one thing leads to another. I talk to another person, go to other libraries, and eventually I get the book. You just take, one step at a time.
Yeah, so it's kind of incremental that you had one thing and then you just kept getting deeper.
Absolutely. And finding things in books where you wouldn't expect there to be stuff about screenwriting, biographies of stars, biographies of producers. There's biography of Sam Goldwyn that has surprising amount about his involvement with screenwriters, and you pick it up. And as I discovered, if there's not stuff like that, you're sort of in a bad way. People now read Framework, and one of the big questions they have is, well, why don't you have more about Frances Marion? Well, when I read her biography, the name escapes me. Anyway, I wasn't very impressed because it was mostly about social life in Hollywood. And then I saw her in person at a screening at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and I was equally unimpressed. But then Carrie Beecham comes along. She looks at Marion's autobiography and says, wow, this is an interesting person. And then she goes and writes, without lying down, one of the great screener biographies. If I'd had that, then I would have done more with her. Yeah, it's just, you started sort of an upside down Frank. You got one point. Frank Wood's, Kevin Brownlow's book, they're not helpful. So the Wood stuff is, and then you expand out. And the same thing when you're talking to people, you usually have one thing you want to talk to them about. And then you get them to talk about other stuff. One of the secrets I found in interviewing people is two secrets. You do your research, find out as much as you can about the person, particularly about their early career, because they have forgotten most of that, and they will be impressed that you have discovered this stuff that they've forgotten, and makes them more honest. And then you ask your question, and then you shut the hell up. Because the kind of interviews I did, nobody cares what I think. They want to know what Nunnally Johnson thinks, what Philip Dunn thinks, what Henry King thinks, what all the television writers think about the other people. So you have, I have a ginormous ego, but I can be very modest when I'm interviewing people.
I just wondered why you must have felt that you'd stumbled on a real goldmine in those early chapters in Framework, and I was just wondering, had you been maybe recruited to write a different kind of a book, or because you say it becomes more stories about the screenwriters and their lives and so on and so forth. I just wondered why you got, there's so much interesting stuff just about the scripts in the very early cinema, but you then move on to other things.
Well, part of that is it became obvious that one of the points I would have to make in that early section is the nonsense that there were no screenplays in silent films. And I really wanted to finish that idea off. And you don't find very many people these days. Occasionally, some people who don't know any better saying, oh, they didn't have screenplays in silent films. Most film historians know that now. Because I told you I have a giant ego, because of that first section. The thing is that there was more other material, published material about those later events than there was about the silent film era. And that I just thought I should take advantage of all of that.
Sure. But yeah, the Janet Steiger book, the Janet Steiger chapters in the classical Hollywood cinema were already out by then, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, they're very good, and I think I referred to some of those, but yeah, I read that. I love that book because it's a terrible idea that works. You know, like making a rap musical about Alexander Hamilton. That's a terrible idea, and it works. In the case of classical Hollywood cinema, what they do is rather than simply write about the classic movies, they have this selection that of classics, non-classics, everything like that. So when you're reading that book and you turn the page, you never know what movie you're going to get on the next page. It may be Citizen Kane, it may be a B Western, and it keeps you going like that. I love that book for that reason. Anyway, yeah, that's why I was finding different stuff that was useful. And partly that's one of the reasons I was sort of limited. I don't think the publisher ever said this, but I think they're limiting it to 100,000 words. I'm not sure this ever got discussed, but at that time, since this was the first book on the history of screenwriting in American film, and nobody knew if it would work or anything like that, they were obviously being cautious. One of the things that I get so depressed about now is there are now 38 years after Framework came out. And I would have thought by now that somebody would have done, you know, Framework's. Somebody should have done a 600-700 page book on the history of screenwriting in American film. There's a lot more to write. You can write more about screenplays. You can write more about silent screenwriters that have come along. There are there's a lot of information that's now in libraries that weren't when I started. I mean, I was lucky with the Dudley Johnson book that all the story files, the business files were on the lot at 20th Century Fox. And I got permission to go in, and I convinced the guy who was the head of it, who sat in a little office there, that I was a serious person. And the way we'd set it up at Fox, I had to call the day before to an executive who would let the guy know at the warehouse for the stuff that was coming in. After I was there off and on for a couple of weeks, the guy said to me, "Tom, you can come anytime you want. You don't have to call him. Just call me anytime, day or night." And I wish I could have lived there forever. But that was not available. But a lot of the studio stuff is available. I mean, the Fox stuff is, I think, at USC now. I think the Fox story files are at USC. The business stuff is at UCLA. I think that's where the MGM files are at USC. And again, you talk to the right people. I did an article on Rear Window. And I wanted to see the stuff that the John Michael Hayes had done, because Hitchcock was finishing up Dial M for Murder, and said to Hayes, "Okay, here's the story we want to tell. Here's the short story, Cornell Roach's short story. Go ahead and start on that, do a treatment." And so the Hitchcock files are at the Herrick Library. And a treatment that Joshua Logan did when he owned the rights to Dial M for what became Rear Window, was there. But this treatment that John Michael Hayes had done was not there. And I talked to, I think it was Barbara Thompson, and, you know, it's not there. Do you have any idea where it could be? This is the Hayes treatment. And no. Next day she calls me and says, "Guess what I found? It's not in the Hitchcock files. It's in the Paramount story files. When do you want to come over? I said, I'll be there in about 5 minutes. And it pretty much proves that nearly everything that's good and interesting in the Rear Window comes from John Michael Hayes. It's there in the treatment, which is why Hitchcock didn't put it in his files, because it disproves his notion that he, contributed enormously to the film. And I got an article on it, and it's interesting. As far as I know, none of the Hitchcock people are devotees of come and said it's wrong, because you got the stuff there. I mean, it's there in the files.
Can I ask one question if there isn't anything else? It was just not really a question, but I was thinking about what you were saying, Tom, about the myth that was spread about the no script myth, and I was thinking one of the most paradigmatic cases is probably the Little Rascal series, because of course you have this team of writers, these generations of new filmmakers and writers that basically came out of that training ground. But because there's the myth that the kids didn't have written lines, then there were no scripts. But actually, the scripts were there even without the lines, even during the silent era, and then even when transitioning into the talking years. I was wondering whether you actually came across any of those scripts when you ever had the chance to study the Little Rascals scripts or the series, and if you came across any in your archival searches.
No, I was never a Little Rascals fan, and I had more than enough to do with Frank Woods and Jules Firthman and Ben Hecht and Nunnally Johnson and all those others. Again, let me encourage anybody who's listening to this now or later, if you want to sit down and do a really big book on the history of screenwriting, there are all kinds of areas that I couldn't get into. I mean, in the third edition of Framework, I added an appendix of subjects for further research. And some of those had been done by the time I did that, but there's still a lot of others. And there are a lot of other ways to go. I mean, it would never have occurred to me to do what Stephen has done, a book on the screenplay format. Wonderful stuff there. And it gives you a sense of how they work. Yes, absolutely. Other people find other ways to go, and we see some of that in the volumes, the Women Screenwriters volume that came out a while back, and this current one. By the way, I do want to show you this. When I won the Lifetime Achievement Award for service to screenwriting research, you didn't give me a statue or a plaque or any money, but my son-in-law, a wonderful guy, has a friend who has a friend who does plaques, and they came up with this, and I don't know if you'll be able to read it. It's wonderful. It's on all the covers of my books, and then the stuff there. I put that on my bookcase, which is right next to the door to my study, and it's right at eye level, so you have to see it when you come in, if you're coming into my upstairs thing. When I brought that down, I thought you guys would be interested. I think Rosamund has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually was kind of the same question. It was. I was going to ask you to elaborate a bit more on the areas that you thought were, should be explored further, even if not by you. So it was kind of the same question, really, as Klaus's.
Yeah. Well, one is film noir. There was not a bunch of stuff that I could find on the writers of film noir. It turns out there was a book done in France that was finally about 3 or 4 years ago published in English called what's it called? Spitballs and something. And the guy had interviewed a lot of great film noir writers, and the film noir section is mediocre. I don't think I did anything really on B westerns, and those are rather interesting. I did an article on the B westerns of Tim Holt And I got into the screenwriting because the scripts are at UCLA, and they have the scripts and the production files, and I can compare them to see how they're doing that. Short films, didn't do anything with the Little Rascals, didn't do anything with the Three Stooges. There's lots to do. So I would hope before I die that somebody does a big full book. There have been 3 histories of screenwriting that followed framework. Ian Hamilton, which borrows more than a lot from framework. Mark Norman's What Happens Next, which borrows a lot of stuff that Hamilton borrowed from me. And then Miranda Banks's book called The Writers, first half of which is awful, the second half is terrific. But I'm waiting for somebody to do that. And the other thing is that my book on television writing went up to 1992. And I had hoped when I retired from teaching in 2011 that I would be able to do a follow-up to that of screenwriting from 92 on, because there's a lot of stuff and not just The Sopranos to do that.
Yeah, I think this is a great ending of this episode, if there are no other questions. Thank you very much, Tom, and I give it over to Paolo to introduce some of our next episodes following in the next months.
Yes, I cannot plug the episode, the March episode, because we're still finalizing the date and the guest. I can tell you, and we'll of course we'll let people know via the mailing list and via the social media accounts, via the social media pages that we have, hopefully in the next few days or weeks. But we're gonna have an episode in March. But we already know that we're gonna have Eva Nour-Prevel in April, and we're gonna have Ian McDonald in May. So we're gonna have episode 3 and 4 of the season already. We know the guests, but episode 2, stay tuned and we'll let you know as soon as possible.